Hi, this is Ashish from developerhead.net and welcome to the next tutorial from Into the Spring series, which is how to create a SOAP-based web services. So the SOAP-based web services are always very complex to create and very complex to consume as well. So I decided to create a very simple web service tutorial for you. So in this tutorial, I will be explaining how you can create a SOAP-based web services in a Spring in very simple way. Plus, in upcoming tutorial, we will also see how we are going to consume this web services. So in this session, I will mostly focusing on how to create. So mostly the coding part. We are not going to cover the theoretical portion. So if you are looking for how to create, then this tutorial is for you. If you want more details or theoretical related details for the code inside, you just let me know in the comment section below and I will try to give the answer as early as possible. So let's proceed ahead and see how we can create a SOAP-based web services in a Spring Boot. So in today's session, we are going to create a calculator web service, which is very simple in terms of the business logic. Now, this calculator's web service will take some input and perform certain kind of operation and provide the result back. So we are creating very simple web services where we are taking the two numbers and we are also going to take the operation type. For example, addition, subtraction, or the deletion, right? And according to the operation type, we are creating the business logic accordingly, and we will send the final response back to the client. So this is what we are going to create in this session. Now let's proceed ahead and start creating the project. Okay, so let's get started with creating very simple Spring project. So project is of type Maven. Spring Boot version we will be using here is 3.4.0, and let's create a group. I will say com.developer dot into the Spring, right? Then artifact ID will be Spring Soap Web Service. So this will be our artifact ID. I will rename the package name. I want a smaller package name, so it will be com.developer.into the Spring. Packaging is of jar and version is 17. Now in dependency section, we are going to add two dependencies which are major. The first is Spring Web dependency because we are creating the web project. And the next is the web service dependency. So I will say web services. So you need to add Spring Web Services, which is used specifically for the SOAP-based web project. There is one more dependency which we need to add for SOAP-based web services. We will be adding it later because it won't be available in this dependencies section. So let's create the project. So I have imported the project into Eclipse. Now, along with web and web services dependency, we also need to add one more dependency, which is WSDL dependency. Okay, so this dependency we need to add WSDL 4J, right? So this is basically required to create our SOAP-based web services and all those functionalities which we required to create the SOAP-based web project. So now next is we need to create our SOAP-based web service definition as what we have seen in our introduction session. So we are going to create the calculator web service. So I am going to create one XSD schema file for our calculator web service. So I will say new and I will say here file and I will say calculator dot xsd. Please note the extension, it should be XSD. You can give whatever name that you want. Okay, let's click finish. Now here we will be going to add the definition of our request and the response for this web services. What are the parameters that we are going to pass in the what are the parameters that we are sending back as a part of the response? And if there are any complex data types, those also need to be added over here. So I already created the details of this and I will paste it. I will just go through this and I will explain what I have created. So here important point to mention over here is the XML and TNS, right? So it should be your appropriate name. So in our case it is WS into the Spring developerhut.com, right? And target namespace is also the same, right? So we are going to get the request object, which consists of the number one, number two, and the operation. So number one and number two is a integer type, and operation is a kind of the complex data type which we need to define. So this is basically an object. Why I took this additional data type? Because I wanted to explain that how we are going to create the complex data type in the SOAP-based web service. It's very easy to create the primitive data type, but or already predefined objects like string. However, if you want to create your custom object, then in that case, this will be very helpful for you. So we have created an operation and we also provide the type which is TNS operation and all its definition is provided here. So this is of a simple type and operation consists of three enumerations. So this is basically kind of an enumeration object which consists of addition, subtraction and multiplication. So these are the three operations we are going to perform in this kind of a web services. And next is the response object, which consists of the final response, which is in the int format. So this is our schema definition. Basically, we can say you can pause the video and you can go through the schema and you can type your schema, or you can also find the schema in my GitHub location. You can simply copy and paste in your project if you are practicing this while watching this video. Now, next is let's create the endpoint and we will define in that endpoint what kind of a operation that this particular SOAP-based web service is made for. So I will simply create one endpoint class. So I will say new class and I will say calculator endpoint. You can give any name, whatever name that you want, right? And I will simply put this in services package. So I will say services, services, right? And you click on finish. Now, the first and most important thing for this class is we need to annotate this class with @endpoint annotation. Okay, this is very important. This is how your service knows that this is basically the endpoint for your SOAP-based web service, which is from the Spring Framework WS Server Endpoint Annotation Endpoint, right? Now, next is we will create our business method, which is going to perform a business logic, right? So I will say public, I will say void for now, and I will say calculate, right? Calculate, and there will be definitely some kind of input, right? But if you see right here in our schema class, we define the get request and get response. However, we don't have these classes. We also need to create these classes, right? However, these classes are still not yet present. Now, how to create these classes, right? So there is very easy way to create this. If you go to your form.xml, you just need to add one important plugin for this, which will help you to create your schema definition into equivalent Java classes. So I will simply copy and paste it. So here you can paste your configuration. This is a plugin which is a Jaxb to Maven plugin, which is we required for this. You just need to make sure that whatever the source that you have given, it should be the correct name. So in our case, we created a calculator.xsd, right? And your calculator.xsd should be here with the same path, right? And if you refresh this, you can find all your classes available in the target generated source JAXP directory, right? So here, if you see, we have created the get request, which consists of definitely two integer and one operation, and your operation is basically a kind of a enum, right? Then if you see the get response, it's simply contain the response, which is again integer response. Now we can use these classes in our endpoint and we can create our web service logic, right? So in our case, what is actually the response is the response here is get response object, right? So I will say get response, right? And we are going to take something which is input. So in this case, our input is get request, right? You can give any name, whatever the name that you want. You can simply give a request as well. That will still work. You just need to update your name in the XSD file, right? You can simply use request and response and operation also, whatever you think is best for your code. So we are taking the request. Now I will just simply add the logic here. So I will say, I will create first get response. I will say get response. I will say response is equal to new get response. So this is something I am going to return back, right? So I will say response. Okay. Now next is we are going to perform some kind of operation. If my operation is addition, then I am going to perform add operation on these two numbers. If it's a subtraction, then it's a subtraction. So let's get an operation, right? So I will say request dot get operation, right? And I will simply collect this in variable. So I will say operation, right? I will say if operation dot add dot equals operation, right? If it's a add, then we will do the add operation, right? So I will simply take the numbers. I will say request dot get number one, right? Plus request dot get number two, and we will collect this result. We'll simply say integer result. Okay. So now we set this result into our response. So I will say response dot set response, which is result, right? So this is very simple, right? I will simply copy this and I will say else if, okay, if it's a subtraction, right? Then we'll simply subtract the numbers, right? And else if it's a multiplication, then we will simply multiply the numbers, right? And then we will set into a response object, right? So this is how our business logic we are going to set it up. You can perform any kind of a business logic, right? Either you can call any kind of a service internally which will connect to the database and get some data or something, right? Everything will work here. I'm just taking very simple example because I want to explain the SOAP-based web service at easiest way to you. Okay. Now there are certain more things we need to perform here is the first is the get request, right? In the get request, we need to add one annotation, which is at the rate request payload. Okay. So we need to tell the, this web service or this endpoint that this is the request payload. We need to fill this object from the payload, right? And the same for the response as well. We need to tell that we are going to whatever the response that we are sending back from this function, that is the response payload. So I will say response payload. I will say response payload. Okay. Now, one more thing is we also need to define something which is called as a payload root, right? So payload root is basically contains the namespace which we given in the XSD file, plus it also contains the local part. Okay, so let's see how we can map this. The first is the namespace, right? So I will simply create the namespace. So I will say private static and final string, which is namespace, right? And I will simply copy the namespace from our XSD file. So this is our namespace, right? Just copy this and put it over here. So this is my namespace, right? And I will just put this namespace in the annotation. So as a namespace, right? Then next is the local part, right? So local part is basically the same name what you have provided as a part of your request name, right? So this is our request, right? Which is coming in the operation, right? So this is something you need to tell that this name should be the same. If this name is not same, it won't work, or it may create some problem, right? So whenever the request come from the XML format, this get request is mapped to this request payload class automatically, and it will fill all the details in this object. Okay, so this is how we have created very simple endpoint. Now, in the next section, we will create the actual service configuration for this. Now, let's create the configuration for our web service, and we will map that configuration to our calculator.xsd schema, right? So I will create very simple class. I will say new class, and I will say web service config. I will put this class in config package, and I will say click on finish. Now the first thing is we need to annotate this class with configuration because we want to load this class during startup. And next and most important is we need to tell the Spring Framework that this class is basically used for the web services kind of a configuration, right? So I will say @ enable web service. Okay, so enable WS, okay, which stands for web service. Now next is we need to extend this class with WS configurer adapter. Okay, and now this class will hold all the configuration related to web services. So whatever the configuration that we add, that will be read during the application startup from this class. Okay, now let's create few beans. So I will say bean, I will say public, and we need to create a servlet registration bin for our message dispatcher servlet. So I will say servlet registration bean. Okay, and I will say message dispatcher servlet. Okay, and I will say message dispatcher servlet or message servlet registration, whatever the name that you wanted to give. This will definitely take some parameter which is application context. Application context. Application context. It is from org Spring Framework. Okay, so that is something you need to take care while adding this argument into this function. Okay, I will say application context, and let's configure this. Now the first is we need to create the message dispatcher servlet, right? So I will create the object. I will simply copy this. I will say message dispatcher servlet. Servlet is equal to new message dispatcher servlet, and now we will set our configuration in this servlet. So I will say first is of course set application context, which is what we got from our Spring Framework, which is from parameter. And next most important thing is we need to set one variable which is set transform WSDL location. Okay, this by default is false. We need to make it true. Okay, and just return this. I will say return new servlet registration bin, right? And we will simply pass this. I will just simply copy this to save some time, and we need to pass our servlet, right? So servlet. So if you see here, this message registration being constructor consists of two kind of parts basically. One is message dispatcher servlet, if you see here, right? And we also need to provide the URL mapping, right? So URL mapping is something which you need to add it over here, right? So what kind of a URL that you want to map? So I will simply say calculator web service, okay? Or you can simply give web service, whatever suits as per your programming style, right? So we will see where we are going to use this. Now we have created a one bean. Now let's create another bean for our XSD class. So I will say bean, right? And we will simply give name is equal to the calculator. Now let's create a method. I will say public. I will say default WSDL one definition. This is the kind of object we need to return. I will create one method and it will take, of course, XSD schema, which we need to pass. So I will say XSD schema and I will say calculator schema. Okay, so this is something we need to tell to our Spring container that we are going to use this calculator schema. Okay, so that it will use this schema internally while getting any request or processing any kind of a request. Now, next is we create the default WSDL11 definition object. So I will say definition and I will say default definition is equal to new object, right? And we will set the appropriate parameters here. So the first thing which we need to tell is what is the port type, right? So I will say set port type name. You can give anything here. So I will say calculator port. Okay, this will be basically appearing in your final WSDL file. So whatever the details that you are adding, so make sure that it should be correct. Okay. Then next is we will set the location URI, right? Which is what we provided as part of URI to our servlet registration bit, right? So this is actually URI over here. So I will say slash calculator web service, right? Now, next and very important to point here is our namespace. So this is something you need to set. Set your target namespace, which is same as what we have added in our endpoint section, right? So I will simply go here and copy this. This is anyway private, so I won't be able to use it. So I will simply copy this and put it here. So my target namespace is this, right? And last and most important is we need to set our schema, right? So default set schema, okay, which is what we got from our method argument, right? So calculator.xst schema will be set over here. Now let's return this object. I will say return default xst, right? Now last and most important thing is this is basically a bin which is returning back. We haven't configured our XSD file anywhere yet, right? So now let's configure that where we can get this, the calculator schema here. If you see the calculator schema, what the parameter we are passing, that bean we need to create. So basically from where this calculator schema will be populated, right? So that for that we need to create one bin. So I will say bin and I will simply say public, which will be returning XSD schema, right? And I will say calculator schema. So make sure that this name should be the same, otherwise it won't pick up. Okay. Okay. So and we'll just simply copy this and I will say calculator schema. Okay, calculator schema, and we will simply creating this object and we will return this object. So here I will say return new simple XSD schema and we will pass our resource. which is calculator.xsd. So I will say new class path resource, and I will say calculator.xsd, right? So this is how we are basically mapping everything to our web services, right? So I hope you understood this. So what are we doing over here is we took the calculator.xsd and we pass it to our default WSDL definition, right? So whenever service is loaded, it will take all the details from calculator.xsd from the schema, and then it will show it as this is my WSDL definition. So whenever we are calling the URL, WSDL URL, all the details of XSD will be printed on the screen or on the browser. We will going to see this in upcoming section. So now let's go ahead and try to run this and see if it works. So now let's try to run this application and see if it's working or not. So I will simply go to project and I will say run as Spring Boot application. So it is giving an error. So basically we missed the URL pattern in our servlet, which is something we need to correct. So here in this, we need to correct this. It should be slash calculator web service slash start. So this correction you need to make. Just make sure that you should do it. And then let's try to run this. I will say Spring Soap web service. And yeah, so our application is started on port 8080. Let's go to browser. So to check if your SOAP-based web service is working or not is you just need to make sure that your WSDL URL should be accessible. Okay, that is the sign that your SOAP web service is properly deployed and is accessible. So let's go ahead. So I will say http:// localhost colon 8080 slash calculator WSDL. This is what the URL is, right? And you need to add your name of your XSD file with a WSDL extension. So I will say calculator dot WSDL WSDL. Okay, and your WSDL file should appear here. Okay, so our web service is properly deployed, right, and it's working. So if you see all the details are here, this basically gives the details about your web service, what kind of a request it is going to take, what kind of a response it is going to give, and what are the different type of a complex type that your web service is supporting, right? And here if you see there are the other parts which by default your Spring framework will add, right? You can also change these details from the web service configuration. However, we are not covering those as of now. Okay, our main focus is how to create this very simple web service. Now we have started our web service and it's working fine. Our URL is working fine. Now the next and very most important section is how we are going to execute this, right? So next, see this in the next section. So to execute our web services, we are going to use the SoapUI tool, which is very popular and very easy for SOAP and REST web services. So for this, you just need to open your SoapUI tool and copy your WSDL URL. So I will simply go here and copy my WSDL URL, and I will go to SoapUI, and you just clicks on the create a new SOAP web project, and you just pass your WSDL URL here, right? So the SOAP UI will create all the requests and responses. So basically it will read the details from the WSDL file and it will create everything which is required to execute this SOAP based web service. Okay. So I will just click on OK. And if you see here, our project is ready for run and it is supported one operation. So if you click on request, you can see this is what the request is, right? So it is asking for number one, the number two, and the operation, right? So let's try to run this. So I will say two and then three, and I will say I want to add. Just make sure that this details should be correct. Otherwise, this will create a problem while running the web service. Your web service will throw a exception, right? So for that, anyway, you can add all the details in your business logic. So let's try to run this. So I will click on submit request, and yeah, we got the response. You see the response is 200. Now if you go to the XML, yeah, so this is the addition result, which is 3 plus 2 is 5. Now let's try to say do the subtraction. I will say subtraction, I will say run, and again I got 200 and I got the correct response, right? And the same wise, if you do the multiplication, this will still work, right? So this is how you are going to create the web service, simple SOAP web service, and this is how you are going to execute your web service from the SoapUI tool, right? So I hope you understand this. Now let's move to the next section. So I hope you understand how to create a simple SOAP-based web service in a Spring Boot. Now in this tutorial, we mostly focus on how to create the SOAP-based web services. In the next section, I will cover how to consume the SOAP-based web services. All the source code which I demonstrated in this tutorial is available on my GitHub repository, and you can find the link in the description section below. If you have any question or queries, you can add it in the description section, and I will try to respond as early as possible. Thanks for watching, and I will see you on the next one.